In this lecture, you'll see how to configure Storage QoS at the command line with a lab demo. I'm logged into my cluster here, and I've already created the volumes that I'm going to be configuring Storage QoS for. Let's have a look. So I'll do a volume show, and you can see in my NAS SVM, I have got volume 1 down to vol 7. And I'm going to configure the different options I've got for QoS on those different volumes. On vol 1, I'm going to configure Storage QoS just to monitor the performance that vol 1 is currently using. On vol 2 and vol 3, I'm going to configure a shared ceiling for them. On vol 4 and vol 5, I'm going to configure a non-shared ceiling. So for vol 2 and vol 3, the value I set is going to be shared by both of them. For vol 4 and vol 5, the value I set, they're both going to have that available to them. I'll explain that more when I actually do the demo in the lab here. And then for vol 6, I'm going to configure a QoS floor. So vol 2, 3, 4, and 5 was a ceiling. Vol 6 is going to be a floor. And for vol 1 to vol 6, that's all going to be standard QoS, where I set a fixed value. For vol 7, I'm going to configure adaptive QoS, where the values are going to change as more data goes into that volume. Okay, so let's get started with vol 1. And when we configure Storage QoS, the way that we do that is with policy groups. So I will say QoS policy-group and a question mark. And you can see it's the standard commands there, so I can create, delete, modify, rename, and show. I'm going to be creating here a question mark again to check the syntax. And first off, I need to create my policy group, give it a name. So I'll say create policy-group. This is going to be for vol 1, so I'm going to name it vol 1 as well. The vServer that vol 1 is in is my NAS vServer, and let's hit the question mark again, and you can see the next things that I would enter is max throughput, min throughput, and is it a shared policy group or not. These are all optional, so I can just hit enter right now, and it's not going to set a minimum or a maximum value here. It's just going to monitor only. So right now I have created my policy group. I also need to put my storage objects into that policy group as well. I said I wanted this to be for vol 1. So I'm going to do a volume modify to put volume 1 in there. Now, the storage objects, it's not just volumes. I could also configure this on a file or a LUN or an SVM as well. But for this demo, I'm going to be working on my volumes. So I say volume modify. The volume is in vServer NAS. The name of the volume is vol 1. And to put it in the policy group, I say QoS-policy group. And the name of my policy group, I also named that vol 1 as well. Okay, so that is it done, and the system is now going to be monitoring the performance of vol 1. In fact, I can have a look at that by saying QoS statistics performance show. And there you can see for vol 1, I can see the current IOPS and throughput and latency. So the reason that I would typically do this would be if I did want to set a QoS minimum or maximum on that volume, but I wasn't sure what value to set yet, I could use this command to see what it's actually using, and then I could base my minimum or my maximum on that. Okay, so that's how to monitor only. I'll hit Control-C to break out of here. Okay, next one that we wanted to do was for vol 2 and vol 3. And that was a shared policy where we're going to set a shared ceiling for both of them. So to do that, I'm going to create a new QoS policy group. And it's going to be create and dash policy group. The name of my policy group, I'll call this one vol 2 and 3. And then the vServer is NAS. I'll hit a question mark again to see my options. I'm going to set a ceiling here. So that is going to be a max throughput. So dash max dash throughput. And for this example, I'm going to set that to 50,000 IOPS. And then I could also set is shared here. And you can see that the default value is true. So by default, this policy group, this value is going to be shared by both volume 2 and volume 3 when I add them to the policy group. So that 50,000 IOPS, they've got that between them. So if vol 2 is using 30,000, there's only going to be 20,000 left for vol 3. Okay, that's the default anyway, so I can just hit enter here. Again, I need to remember to assign my volumes to the policy group, but it's not going to do anything. So that is going to be volume modify. The vServer is NAS. The volume is vol 2 first. And then QoS dash policy group that I'm going to assign this to is vol 2 and 3. And then I can hit the up arrow and I'm going to add vol 3 as well. So I'm now limiting the maximum amount of IOPS that's available to vol 2 and vol 3. Okay, next one that I said I was going to do was a ceiling again for vol 4 and vol 5, but this is going to be non-shared. So this time they're both going to get the maximum that I set each. So let's do that. So this is again going to be QoS policy dash group create, and then the name of my policy group, I'll call this one vol 4 and 5. The vServer is NAS, and for this one I'll set the same max throughput again, which was 50,000 IOPS. But this time I am going to say that dash is shared is false. So now if vol 4 is using 30,000 IOPS, vol 5 doesn't just have 20,000 IOPS, vol 5 has still got 50,000 IOPS available as well. So the difference with when it's non-shared is they get that maximum amount each, not shared between them. Again, I need to add my volumes here, so I'm going to hit the up arrow to do it this time. And this is for vol 4 and 5. And I'm going to add vol 4. And then hit the up arrow again and add vol 5 as well. Okay, so that was my shared and my non-shared setting a ceiling. Next, I'm going to set a floor. So this is a minimum value that's going to be available for vol 6. So to do that, similar command again, it's going to be QoS policy group create, and then the name of the policy group, I'll call this one vol 6. The vServer is the NAS vServer. And now, rather than a max throughput, I'm going to set a min throughput, and I'll say this is 1000 IOPS. And hit enter. And then I need to add my volume to it. So the name of my policy group was vol 6. And I'm going to add vol 6 there. Okay, and now I am getting a warning message. The reason is that I'm working on the simulator right now. Setting a throughput floor is only supported on AFF systems. So that's why I'm getting a warning message here saying it's not going to work. It still allows me to enter the commands again. Okay, and the last one that I wanted to set up was adaptive QoS. So all the ones that I did already were standard storage QoS where I set a fixed value, and it doesn't matter if the amount of data in the volume is changing or if the size of the volume itself is changing. But typically I'm going to want the min or the max values to scale in line with the size of the volume. And a way that I can do that is with adaptive QoS. So let's do that for vol7. So to do that, the command is, rather than QoS policy group, it's QoS adaptive policy group. So QoS adaptive policy group, and then create. And then the name of my policy group, I'll call this one vol7. The vserver is NAS. And then I'll hit the question mark. And the values that I need to set here, the expected IOPS, this is the QoS floor, so the minimum value. The peak IOPS is the maximum value. And then the absolute minimum IOPS, that is the absolute least that it can possibly be. Because this is adaptive QoS, if I set a minimum and a maximum value there, it's going to be based on the actual size of the volume or the amount of data in the volume. So let's say that I've just created a new volume and there's hardly any data in it. Well, because this is adaptive QoS, if I set the QoS to be based on the amount of data in the volume and there's hardly any data there, then this volume is going to get hardly any IOPS, basically none. So I need to wait for the amount of data in the volume to ramp up before this is going to be working correctly. So to stop me having that problem, what I can do is I can set an absolute minimum IOPS. So what this does is it says never go below this value. So that's going to come into effect when the volume is basically empty. And then when the volume starts to fill up, that's when the expected IOPS will kick in, and that will scale in line with the actual amount of data in there. Okay, I've also got the expected IOPS allocation and the peak IOPS allocation. So this is for saying, is it going to be based on the actual allocated space? So that's the actual size of the volume, or the used space, the amount of actual data in the volume. Typically, you're going to be wanting to use the used space in here. So it's going to scale in line with how much data is actually being used. And then finally, if you're setting a throughput in megabytes per second, then you want to set the block size as well. If you're using IOPS, then that's not really important. Okay, so let's go and fill in the details. So I'm going to enter an expected IOPS, the minimum. And for my expected IOPS, I'll say 100 IOPS per terabyte. And then the maximum is my peak dash IOPS, which I will set to 1,000 IOPS per terabyte. And then I'll say my peak dash IOPS dash allocation. I want to do this based on used space, how much is actually being used. And then because this is a new volume, there's no data in it yet, I'm going to also set an absolute dash min dash IOPS, and I'll say 100 IOPS. So you can see the rest of the values are per terabyte, so that's going to scale. The absolute minimum IOPS is a fixed value, where I say the absolute minimum that this is going to get is 100 IOPS. Let's put a small value in there just because I'm working on the simulator in a lab environment. Okay, that's me done, and I can hit enter. And again, don't forget to actually assign your storage object to the policy group as well. So I need to say volume modify, and this was on vserver NAS. The volume is vol7, and rather than a QoS policy, it's now a QoS-adaptive policy, and the name was vol7. Okay, and that's me done. That is all of my different policies created and now in effect. To check that I have created them successfully, I will say QoS policy group show, and that will show me my non-adaptive policies, and that's good. I can see the name of the policies and what the settings are. I can also do a QoS adaptive policy group show, and I'll see my adaptive policy group there. So vol7, that was the one that I created. Notice that I've also got my 3 default adaptive policy groups there as well. So these are already on the system when you first install the system. And you'll see that if you're going to do the deploying your applications using the wizard in System Manager, I'll show you how to do that later in this section, that those are the service levels that are available there: extreme, performance, and value. You'll see that later in this section where that's used in the GUI. Okay, and the last thing, I'll view the values, the actual performance that is being used by my different volumes. So I will say QoS statistics, and I'll do a question mark here, and you see that you can do reports based on volume, workload, resource, performance, etc. Here, I'm going to view the performance, show, and it's going to help if I do that without a typo, right? So let me type with performance instead. And there I can see, again, the IOPS, the throughput, and the latency. Now, in the lab I'm working on here right now, I'm sending some load to volume 1. So that's why you can see I'm getting a report for vol 1 here. If you're wondering, well, why am I not seeing anything for the other volumes? It's because they're not doing any work. They're not actually processing any requests. So because of that, because there's nothing to report, I'm not seeing it in the output here. Thanks for watching. If you want to get hands-on practice with Cisco networks for free, then you can download my 400-page CCNA lab guide, which you can see above my head right now. Also, check out the video about my CCNA course. It's the highest rated course online. Thanks.